gonna have to stop here because this is going nowhere. But
what's up?
I'm gonna have to stop with you because this is going nowhere. All I'm going to say is this. To sum up,
I just am trying to understand your perspective. Just one more second. On a
fundamental level, you're shifting definitions to avoid the consequences of your own argument. And if the idea is, final point. If you're going to hold on, if you're.
That is a video that is not only making its rounds, but it does call into question the narrative we heard from the right wing over and over again regarding their values and how they want to protect free speech. The video's from Iowa State University, and of course it's an Iowa State University student debating Ben Shapiro during a presentation by the conservative commentator titled, "To Save America, Wokeness Must Be Destroyed." And for once in his life, Ben Shapiro actually struggled to overpower the student and the argument that he was trying to make. Now, to give you some more context from this clip, just want to note that was toward the end of his exchange with this student. So how did it begin? Well, the student notes that he is also Jewish, and he starts by getting Ben Shapiro to show some empathy. Then he goes back to essentially tying that into the argument that he tries to make to persuade Shapiro. Let's watch how it all went down.
Do you come from Holocaust survivors, or are you a Jewish family that didn't?
So my great-great-grandparents arrived here. A lot of our extended family was killed in the Holocaust, but our immediate family.
Your great-great-grandparents, but not your grandparents.
Right.
Oh, do you have friends whose grandparents were Holocaust survivors or anything like that?
Of course, many of them. Yeah, I've helped write memoirs of Holocaust survivors.
Yeah. Their families are kind of messed up, right? Like my family is very messed up.
I mean, if you go through a trauma like the Holocaust, I would imagine
they teach that trauma between generations. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, trauma very often in a lot of circumstances is passed down. I mean, I know some kids of Holocaust survivors who turned out fantastic and some who didn't. I mean,
yeah. Okay, so you are officially woke. That is what wokeness is about. It's like, people's grandparents or their great-grandparents were slaves.
Well, it's okay, no, it's okay.
Silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge's administration. Do you know about like the Great Mississippi Flood back in the 1930s?
I understand that American history is filled with racial evil.
Yeah. And that causes some intergenerational trauma, which affects people's ability to be, effective, things like that.
Fine.
So we have more from this exchange. I have to say, so far, it's impressive how the student is handling this exchange. I think it's a smart way of trying to calmly explain, what it seems like conservatives like Ben Shapiro have a difficult time understanding because these are issues that don't pertain to them and their lived experience. But I like that the student touched on something that Shapiro can relate to tie it back into this argument, this anti-woke argument that we hear from the right wing over and over again. We have more clips from this exchange, but before we get to it, Cenk, what are your thoughts? I know you've been going hard against conservatives and their hypocrisy on freedom of speech on Twitter.
Yeah, for sure. So I love how this student set a trap for Shapiro. I mean, he fell right into it. And you could tell for the rest of the exchange, he was super uncomfortable and he seemed a little shaken because normally he would see that coming, but the setup was perfect. He got him talking about his own experience. And that's the thing with conservatives. When it's about them, they care deeply and they get it. Oh, intergenerational trauma, of course I understand that. Oh my God, and he's got him empathizing. He goes, now, can you see that the same thing would happen for black people? He's like, oh, you really didn't see it coming. And no, of course, instantly he's like, no. Only applies to me, it doesn't apply to anyone else. Of course it applies to everyone else. But it's not just the trauma. Look, intergenerational trauma is something that so many people can relate to. Certainly Armenians can relate to, Jews can relate to, and the list goes on and on of the people that have suffered that. And certainly African Americans in this country, Native Americans in this country. But in this case, it's even worse than that because it's not something that happened in a different country and that didn't have a direct effect on you. It's not just intergenerational. The wealth that was accumulated was passed on by different races in this country, but African Americans were literally blocked from accumulating wealth. They were not allowed to get houses in certain areas, and so many of the rules were very much literally rigged against them. So now that intergenerational poverty has also been passed down. So they started at a massive disadvantage. I love that he got Ben to understand that when it came to his own context, but of course, Ben wouldn't acknowledge it in anyone else's context.
You know, I want to provide another example in regard to what the African American community has gone through in this country in recent history, because you know, yes, you can talk about slavery, you can talk about the Jim Crow era, but think about what mass incarceration meant for so many families, Black families across this country, where you have Black men who end up spending an insane amount of time behind bars for something as simple as marijuana possession, something that our own politicians and former presidents bragged about doing when they were in college. And then think about the kind of trauma that children undergo seeing their fathers be placed behind bars for a nonviolent offense like marijuana possession. Think about the impact that has on, his partner, on his children. So, I actually really, look, I know that we do these stories time to time and it just kind of comes across as like, conservatives getting dunked on. But I actually really appreciate this exchange because this is the kind of exchange that I think does lead to a far more fruitful and nuanced discussion. And what I also appreciated about this student was that he was not willing to get steamrolled. So let's take a look at a little more of this exchange.
Okay, so let me
okay, things like that.
Fine. So let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Why, so if the idea is that history has consequences, of course that's true. That's not wokeness.
Yeah.
That is not wokeness. What wokeness suggests is that fundamental institutions in American society
no, it doesn't.
Yes, it 100% does.
I ran Elizabeth Warren's campaign. I helped organize her volunteers around here. I am a representative of wokeness.
Okay.
When I went to go get my first tattoo, the guy had lightning bolts and 88s tattooed on his neck. And as a Jewish person, that's really messed up. It's basically a threat.
There are racist people who exist. The argument that you're making, and I'm going to close with this because this is going in weird directions, and I don't really want to.
No, it's not going in a weird direction.
I don't really want to get. No, just hold up a second. I let you get out your arguments, and now it's time for me to respond because I let you say the full argument.
Okay, I'll let you respond, but
no, not but. Now's my turn. The reason your definition isn't accurate is because any sentient human being would acknowledge that history has consequences.
Right.
But if the idea is, but that's not what wokeism is. Wokeism is a different thing. Wokeism suggests that all inequalities of today are attributable to not only historic injustices, but also continuing injustices in the now, and that all disparity is attributable to discrimination.
Like that, but a conservative.
Not just that.
A conservative is the only person. I want to know why. Why is it that conservatives are the only people who define it like that? Why are conservatives the only people?
Okay, so we're gonna have to stop here because this is going nowhere.
No, he shuts down the student later. We'll show you that video. But before we do, I just wanted to make a quick point about, it's interesting because conservatives tend to, on one hand, defend our institutions and talk about how important our institutions are and how they're not racist and how they're not inherently flawed. Everything is hunky-dory, everything is great. But they also love dismantling our institutions. I mean, there's so much distrust toward our institutions from the right wing in America. So like with every other issue that we talk about pertaining to the right wing, they always tend to cherry pick whatever conveniently fits the narrative that they're putting out there. On one hand, our institutions are great. On the other hand, these institutions are terrible. Let's dismantle them. Now, their complaints about our institutions are different, obviously, from the complaints that you might hear from the left. But I found that an interesting point of this whole exchange.
Yeah, so there's so many great parts of this. He's trying to knock down the caricatures that they set up of the left wing. They do straw man arguments, right? The left wing says this. He's like, no, I'm right here. I was an integral part of Elizabeth Warren's campaign. I'm the progressive you guys are talking about. And I'm telling you the progressives don't think that. And they're like, boo, we were having fun doing a caricature, debating a caricature version of you. Now you actually show up and you're kicking our ass. We don't like that. Stop with the facts, boo. And they're gonna shut him down in a minute, as you'll see in the video. But look, I thought the whole point of free speech was an exchange of ideas. And here we are having a really good exchange of ideas. So why would you shut it down? And note, by the way, if you say, oh, well, the student went on for a while, Ben asked them a question, asked them to participate more, and then when he gave an excellent answer, Ben's like, okay, this isn't going anywhere. Well, it was going somewhere.
This is going in weird places.
Yeah, it went to a weird place where you were wrong and he was right. And you think that's weird, the rest of us think that's Tuesday, okay? And then one more thing for now. If you notice the dismissive tone that Shapiro has about racial injustice, yeah, we know that there's racial incidents and there's racial injustice, yeah. Now imagine if somebody had said that about the example that the student gave, the Holocaust. They're like, yeah, we know the Holocaust happened. Okay, all right, but get past it. That would not sit well, nor should it. But why does this sit well with him and other conservatives when you say it about black people?
Now, let's take a look at the last clip and see how this all ended.
If the idea is that traumas of the past invariably bleed down into the present, that does not explain why certain groups that have been historically not only marginalized but slaughtered in mass genocide are some of the most successful groups in our society. So if the idea is, that past trauma always equals current inequality, or that my actions in, say, robbing a convenience store are attributable to bad actions that happened in Alabama in 1930, the answer to that is no. Don't rob the convenience store. The only way they are going to be able to break the chain of history is to make good decisions.
I mean, the caricatures continue, right? Because what he's implying there is that, the left wing serve as apologists for any type of crime that's committed by essentially excusing it by pointing to past traumas. That's not what the left is interested in doing. But the left is interested in showing the inherent flaws in our institutions in terms of targeting in a negative way certain groups of people. I mean, we gave the example of that insanely lengthy investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. And they had the data, they had the statistics, they showed the disproportionate number of black people in Minneapolis who get stopped if the officers are able to see the race of the individual driving the vehicle. So during the daytime, black drivers are 12% more likely to be pulled over by the cops. At night, that disparity actually doesn't exist because they have a far more difficult time seeing the race of the driver. I mean, there's so much data. We've shown you the data regarding marijuana arrests, where you have both white individuals and black individuals consuming marijuana at similar rates, but black individuals are 4 times more likely to be prosecuted for marijuana possession. I mean, the facts are out there. And so when you point to those disparities, when you point to those numbers, it's real easy to dismiss those numbers by, painting this ridiculous caricature of the left, essentially being nothing more than apologists for crime, including robberies of convenience stores.
Yeah, no, look, we're fair. We showed you Ben's point that the audience loved. They gave a big applause line there. Now, but let's break it down. He actually said something deeply offensive there. He's like, look, there was other people who went through generational trauma, seemingly referring to the example they were discussing, the Holocaust, and Jews across the world. And we recovered and we did great, but black people didn't. First of all, that's disgusting, okay? Second of all, it is totally factually incorrect because it leaves out a giant part of the story, generational wealth. So Jews were slaughtered during the Holocaust, and what happened to them was one of the most horrific things that has ever happened. And there's tons of irony in that, because in the old days, the way that Jews in Europe accumulated wealth is because, ironically, of anti-Semitism. So the Christians and the Muslims didn't want to do usury, so they said, okay, the Jews, let them charge interest. That's how you got the stereotype of Jews being bankers, because they were forced into it because of anti-Semitism, because they thought, the Christians and the Muslims thought they were above it and that they wouldn't do something immoral like that. But if you charge interest, you make a lot of money. That's how it normally works. Also, Jews weren't allowed to own land, so it forced them to become merchants. But you actually make decent money as a merchant. This is where the kernel of the anti-Semitism stereotype comes from. But it wasn't Jews' fault, they were forced into it. And then the idiots who had the anti-Semitic ideas in the first place were like, oh, oops, we screwed up. they made all that money, and then they hated the Jews, and then they killed the Jews. So it was deeply, deeply unfair to Jews all across the world. But through that process, in a deeply ironic way, they did accumulate generational wealth that they could pass on. Guys, I don't want you to make the mistake of thinking, oh, that means all Jews have a lot of money. That's not remotely true. You can't do blanket generalizations. It's just not true today, right? And right now, of course, the overwhelming majority of bankers in America and in the world are not Jewish, right? But I'm telling you the history of it to give you the context that Ben left out. So African Americans were systematically prevented from getting generational wealth that they could pass on in this country because of laws, violence, terrorism against them, and literal slavery. But Jews, as they were destroyed and horribly mistreated, were able to keep generational wealth. So when he basically goes, ha, we made it, as if it was his great efforts in his own life that he pulled himself up by his bootstraps and black people in America didn't. That is deeply misleading and very offensive. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR, so those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.